We're incredibly lucky to have our second speaker with us in person today, all the way from Texas. Dr. Charlie Love is a professor in the Department of Large Animal Clinical Sciences at Texas A&M and a diplomat of the American College of Theriogenologists. Dr. Love is a world-renowned stallion expert and internationally recognized for his extensive and groundbreaking research in stallion fertility. And today we'll be talking about his work on record analysis systems for critically evaluating stallion fertility and ways in which we might improve their reproductive fertility. Thank you, Charlie.
Good morning. Everybody, I think everybody can hear well. Thank you, Camilla, for that introduction. I wish I could have introductions like that daily. That would definitely improve your attitude. But thank you. Also, I'd like to thank the Charitable Trust, the Gerald Lee Charitable Trust, for inviting me to do this. This is a privilege to come here, and it's extremely, I feel extremely important or fortunate to be able to come and do this. So this title of my talk is fairly simplistic. It's about stallion fertility and reproductive efficiency, and I'm going to cover kind of three general topics today. It's a huge subject area, and you certainly can't cover all of it in this period of time. So I'm going to go over, first of all, how we evaluate stallion fertility, and it primarily deals with evaluating the breeding records. So I'm going to go over that for a period of time. Then I'm going to jump to reinforcement breeding, which I think is something that's unique to the thoroughbred industry, and go through some of the work that we've done looking at the effects of reinforcement breeding. And then I'm going to switch over and talk about the evaluation of the stallion testicle itself, which is a very important part of not just the breeding soundness evaluation, but it becomes particularly important when we talk about first season infertility insurance. So there's kind of three different topics that I'm going to go over. The first thing to talk about when you talk about fertility is to try to come up with some type of definition as to what you think it is. It tends to be a fairly abstract concept. We all have different ideas of what low fertility is, subfertility, normal, high, and that kind of thing. This is some of the work we've done quite a while ago, and this is my kind of generic view of what stallion fertility looks like. This was done in a group of different stallions. It included thoroughbreds, standard breds, horses bred by live cover, AI, cooled semen. So it's kind of a mishmash that's been thrown together. But I think it's a fairly good reference point from which to look at stallion fertility. The majority of stallions, to me, fit in this bell curve, in the bell right here. And they fall between about 45 and 75% per cycle pregnancy rate. That's a big range. But I think the reason that's important is that depending on how you're breeding the stallions can slide up and down this scale fairly easily. So the thoroughbred instance is probably the most fertile breeding situation that we have outside of actual feral breeding itself. So you can take a thoroughbred stallion that may be up here, but if you start doing things to him, freezing his semen, using cooled semen, introducing the influences of management into that horse may slide down the scale and actually get into a problem circumstance. So I think this is fairly good. The horses down below 45% start to be recognized as a problem by managers, by veterinarians, and low fertility starts to be recognized, and we're asked what we can do to try to figure out why that fertility is low or subfertile. I really don't get caught up in what a definition of subfertile is. Subfertile is pretty much the definition of the manager or the owner of that horse. They're dissatisfied, and that becomes subfertile. So to pick a point and say it's 45% or 35% is kind of a waste of time. If the owner or the manager feels they have a problem, then you have a subfertility problem. We don't worry too much about those horses on the upper end. They pretty much get their mares pregnant, and they're not a particular problem. So as we go through this later on, I'll show you some examples of how we've used this, but that's my general idea of how I think of horse fertility. So when we get in and are faced with a situation where there is concern about the fertility of a particular stallion, the breeding records are an extremely useful way of trying to figure out the source of that problem. And the thoroughbred breeding records are the best because you keep track of everything fairly critically. This is pretty much a generic breeding record form over here. It's pretty straightforward. You have the mare identification. You have the beginning status of that mare, how she starts the breeding season. Is she a maiden mare? Is she a foaling mare or a barren mare? The date she foaled, if she's a foaling mare, the date she bred, and of course whether she became in foal or not. And you can also have the age of the mare, which obviously is a very important factor with respect to fertility. So breeding records are important. One reason is they objectively describe fertility. A lot of these instances where we're presented with a problem, there are a lot of different opinions as to what the problem may be. The mare owner may think it's the stallion's fault, the stallion owner may think it's the mare's fault, or together they may just think that the management is the problem by itself. So you can have three different areas, and your job is to try to sort out and really come up with an objective reason as to why that horse or other reasons for the subfertility. We also want to determine how bad the fertility is. Again, people have varying opinions. If it's my mare and she's not pregnant, the fertility is really bad, but she may be only one out of 90 other mares that was open, and the fertility of that stallion is quite good. So we want to determine how bad that is. Is it in the 50% range, or is it way down in the 20% per cycle pregnancy rate? And so we just want to put numbers on the fertility. And then finally, of course, as we discussed, we want to determine the source of the fertility or infertility. In general, there are three main sources. It's the male, the female, and in the case of the horse industry, we have management, and that involves us, the veterinarians, it involves the farm managers as well. That gets to be a fairly uncomfortable conversation to have when we start having concerns that it may be a management problem in addition to maybe a stallion and a mare problem as well. So the records can really help us try to sort this out. How do we do that? Well, the breeding season is a very dynamic time period. It's not generic. It doesn't start February 15th and the fertility remains at a certain flat level through February, March, April, through the end of the breeding season. Very different things happen throughout the breeding season, and you're all well aware of that. So we want to look at chronologically how the fertility of a stallion goes throughout the breeding season. We want to see times where he does well, and then we want to also identify those times where he may have valleys in his fertility and why those valleys occur. So we can do that, and this actually originated, we originated this from dairy records. And those of you that may be familiar with the dairy industry, a lot of dairy practitioners will have a chart on the wall that shows the fertility of the dairy cows as they go throughout the year. So every time a cow comes back pregnant, they'll go up one notch, which is what you see here. And every time a cow comes back open, they'll go down. So throughout, chronologically, you can see rises and you'll see falls in fertility. And we did that with these breeding records. So this is an example of what I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides. This zero line here, when the fertility is on that zero line, is essentially a 50% per cycle pregnancy rate. So this horse bred two mares on January or February 15th. Both of them got pregnant, so they went up two notches. The next day he bred two on February 16th, and they were both open. So we went back down two notches. So his overall pregnancy rate to that point in time is a 50% per cycle pregnancy rate. And so that's one of the things we're going to use as we look at the chronology. So I'll give you an example of that here. So this is a stallion that was a thoroughbred stallion that you can see that he had a book of 75 mares. His seasonal pregnancy rate wasn't bad, but it was 77%. And in this case, the concern was why the foaling mares were less than the overall pregnancy rate. We expect the foaling mares to have higher fertility because they've just had a foal, and by and large, by definition, they're fertile individuals. So there was concern as to why those foaling mares were less than the average of the other mares. So this is what we do. This shows the chronology all the way from early in the breeding season, about February 15th, all the way to the early part of July here. The major thing to look at here is this blue line, and this shows the accumulation of breedings in a week prior to any particular breeding. So for instance, if we take May 9th right here and we go up here, this horse bred about 12 or 13 mares in the week prior to that mare being bred on May 9th. So that gives us an idea of the effect of the amount of breeding that a stallion went through, with the idea that if a stallion may breed more mares, there may be less sperm for that mare bred on May 9th than if he bred fewer mares in the week prior to that. So it gives us an idea of accumulation of breedings. The green line are just simply the number of mares that the stallion bred on those particular days. So you can very quickly go through, and as you would expect when you have a peak here, you would have more mares being bred on a daily basis prior to that. So he has a few days off, as they do with a book of 75 mares. This is also pretty characteristic of the breeding season in general, so there's nothing unusual about this. Early in the breeding season, stallions tend to breed fewer mares. And then as you get into April and May, when the foaling mares start to come into the breeding season, they get lumped on top of the maiden and barren mares, and so you get a peak like this. So this is a very characteristic graph of the breeding season of your average thoroughbred stallion. But nevertheless, one of the questions we're interested in asking here is whether the stallion is overbred. It's one of the first questions people ask, and you can determine this. Obviously, early in the breeding season, this horse bred fewer mares. Later in the season, they breed fewer mares, and then right in the middle there's a big spike in the number of mares that this stallion bred. So we're interested in whether this stallion was overbred or not. And so we can superimpose fertility on top of this. This is the same blue line and green line in the previous slide, but this line right here is the one we're primarily interested in. That's the one that keeps track of the pregnancy results throughout the breeding season. So all the plus ones and minus ones go into that purple line. And remember, the zero line here is a 50% per cycle pregnancy rate. So in this horse, you can see early in the season that he was right around a 50% per cycle pregnancy rate. But then when we got into the peaks here, when he bred more mares, you can see his fertility declined precipitously. And so in this stallion's case, the answer to whether he was overbred is sometimes during the breeding season. Early in the season, he was a very average individual, but when he started breeding more mares, he had a lot of trouble. So in this horse's case, it was probably the stallion that was being overbred as opposed to a problem with the foaling mares themselves. The foaling mares just happened to be available during that time, and that's why they had a decline in their fertility. So for this stallion's case, he was being overbred during the breeding season. So that gives us an initial overall view of the fertility of the stallion. We can stand back, we can look at the breeding season, see the peaks and valleys, see if there's any trend. Sometimes there isn't. Highly fertile individuals will, this line right here will just go straight up like that. It'll be way up in the ceiling. Essentially every mare, not every mare, but just about every mare they breed gets pregnant. They're highly fertile and they're bred to highly fertile mares, and they don't have any peaks and valleys at all. But there are other things we can look at with the breeding records. Obviously, in thoroughbreds, they're unlike artificial insemination stallions that can collect one ejaculate. It can be split however many ways based on the number of mares they want to breed. Thoroughbreds have to breed their mares by live cover in sequence during the day. So one of the questions we're interested in is whether the sequence or the order in which a mare was bred will affect her fertility. We looked at 18 thoroughbred stallions in this little study right here, and in general, you can see from the first to the fourth cover, there really isn't much difference in the per cycle pregnancy rate. It looks like it may decrease a little bit here on the fourth cover, but it's not too far off. But this kind of data is really a bit deceptive because we don't deal with herds of stallions, we deal with individuals. Whether an individual has a problem, people don't come to us and say, well, our herd of stallions has a problem. So we're interested really in individuals. So I show you this, but I kind of hesitate to show you because I think the conclusion may be we can just breed an infinite number of mares and it doesn't make any difference. So I'm going to show you a couple of individual cases here. This is one stallion where that clearly wasn't the case. He had 53 days where he bred 3 mares. Right here on the third cover in, he had 6 days where he bred 4 mares. And you can see an obvious decrease in this stallion's fertility on the third and fourth covers of the day. So this individual was clearly affected, or the mares were clearly affected by the cover on which they were bred. And that would be the kind of thing you would assume, but that's not always the case. These are two stallions where actually the opposite occurred. So we just shouldn't assume that if we breed 3, 4, maybe 5 times a day, that the fertility always decreases on the subsequent covers. These are an example of 2 horses where the exact opposite occurred. These horses had fertility that actually increased from the first to the second to the third cover, and this blue horse right here was particularly important. But you might ask, well, why would that occur? That's kind of a paradoxical result. We don't know. We didn't specifically look at these horses other than to evaluate their breeding records, but there are a couple things that might influence this. One, and I'm going to talk about it in a few slides, is the effect of sperm accumulation on stallions, in which they accumulate sperm most of the time because they're not bred very frequently. But in certain instances, you can actually have stallions that actually will accumulate sperm from one day to the next. We commonly think that if we have an accumulator, we can clean them out early in the breeding season, and then because we breed those stallions frequently, they're kind of cleaned out for the rest of the breeding season. But there are unusual individuals that produce so much sperm that they will actually accumulate between the third cover of the day and the 12 hours or whatever it is to get back to the first cover of the day. So that's one potential reason that this might have occurred. The second reason is that these individuals may have had relatively average to below average sperm quality in terms of their numbers, but also in terms of the morphology and the motility, such that many of the mares will ovulate at night, so they're ovulating out here closer to the third cover of the day than it is to the first cover of the day. So you're actually inadvertently treating these horses as we would a mare that were being bred with frozen semen, trying to get them closer to ovulation. So that may be another reason why this effect occurred. So we can never assume things based on just averages. Averages don't really exist. There are no average individuals and there are no average horses, particularly when we're dealing with horses, because we tend to deal with individuals. So the breeding records to me are they're very interesting. A lot of kind of time consuming, but you get a lot of information. This is kind of an extension of the breeding frequency question that we might have. This is kind of a busy chart here, but we can look at the number of mares a stallion breeds in any particular day, and these are 2 different stallions. And the major difference here is you see the difference in the number of mares between stallion 2 and 1. But I don't want to give you the idea that all stallions' fertility decreases as their mare book increases. That clearly doesn't happen. Most stallions are quite fertile within the number of mares that we ask them to breed now. So this isn't just meant to highlight that the more mares you breed, the fertility declines. But comparing these 2 stallions, it did. So if we look at the number of mares that these stallions breed in a day, on days where they bred 3 mares, this horse's fertility was quite low. So it kind of fits with being overbred. Down here, we look at the actual sessions again. So we can compare on days where he bred 3 mares, compare session 1, 2, and 3, again with the idea that if sperm numbers are decreasing on sessions 2 and 3, that would be less fertility than than session 1. On stallion 1 here, his fertility actually increases, kind of like that previous slide. On the other hand, stallion 2 here decreases on these first 2, and he also increases, not very much, but he clearly is higher than sessions 1 and 2. But the thing that stands out here, we'll also look at the effect of sexual arrest. So this stallion number 2 up here doesn't get too many days of sexual rest, but on days where he may get 1 day off or 2 days off, if he doesn't have enough sperm, you would expect him to be able to positively accumulate sperm numbers, and then he may do better, which is actually what he did. This horse did very well when he was given 1 or 2 days off. So it suggests that in his case, giving him a day off or 2 days off allows him to accumulate enough sperm to go above the threshold dose needed for maximal fertility. On the other hand, this horse actually goes down. He has just the opposite effect. So these are important things to find out when we're evaluating the breeding records. So the question kind of comes, is this horse subfertile? Well, under the conditions that he's being bred, he is. But clearly, if the conditions are ideal, he's a very fertile horse. So we have to be careful about labeling horses as subfertile. they may be subfertile or less fertile under the conditions that we're breeding them in. So I mentioned sperm accumulation previously, and it's probably the most common condition that we see in stallions. And it's important for several reasons. One, it's a highly reversible condition. So it's something we can do something about just as long as we recognize that it's occurring. It tends to occur in stallions that are at sexual rest, and it tends to occur in stallions that have very large testicles because they're producing a lot of sperm, but they have the inability to normally pass sperm out in their urine, and instead it backs up and it accumulates and it causes the problem. It tends to be characterized by poor sperm quality with a variety of presentations. If the ampulla are completely blocked, you may not see any sperm at all. It's a very extreme condition, but it does occur. More commonly, we see things like low motility. We'll see a variety of abnormalities that are shown here. So we'll commonly see a lot of detached heads. We'll see detached midpieces and tails. We'll see a lot of distal droplets, or we may see this distal midpiece reflex or the hairpin tail in a variety of presentations. So the morphology is very important in diagnosing these individuals. The other thing we'll see are very high sperm numbers because these horses have been accumulating sperm instead of passing it out normally in the urine. So when they do ejaculate, large numbers, 20, 30, sometimes 40 billion sperm may come out in an ejaculate. And that may continue over a period of days, and in some of these cases it may occur for several weeks. So it can take a long time to clean these horses out. This image right here is an example of what you may see under the microscope. This is a clumping of sperm that occurs in the ampulla. The sperm get in there and they get packed in there because they can't normally pass out in the urine. And so these are made up of packed up, detached heads, and you can see midpieces and tails that are just smashed together. So that's a very common presentation when we evaluate these horses. One of the things that may happen with these individuals is that you may see reduced fertility early in the breeding season because they haven't been cleaned out, and these horses are breeding mares with reduced sperm quality. To tell you a little bit more about the condition, these are just a few pictures to give you some examples of what you may see. On the lower left-hand corner there is a filter, and that sediment that you see down there is sediment, and it's those clump sperm that I showed you on the previous slide. And so when you're evaluating these, it's important to take that filter and evaluate it because you may miss part of your diagnosis. The other thing you'll see, these are comparing two different cups of semen here. The cup on the top is a relatively normal appearing milk-like consistency. On the lower slide, there is one that's commonly seen with stallions that accumulate. And when you first look at it, it obviously looks yellow, and your first thought is that this may be purulent, an infection, or it may be urine. And actually, it's neither of those. It's yellow like that because the sperm is so concentrated that it gives off that yellow hue. Very easy to diagnose it by simply looking under the microscope. You won't see white cells, you won't see urine crystals, but you'll see large numbers of sperm, and you'll probably see those clumps and those various abnormalities that we talked about. This condition occurs primarily in the reproductive tract of the stallion, the internal reproductive tract, and this is an internal tract. This is the rectum down here. These are two bulbourethral glands, two lobes of the prostate, but the accumulation occurs primarily in these ampulla, these two sausage-looking structures right here. And the reason it can accumulate there is that's a potential space for things to accumulate in. There really is no other potential space in the excurrent system of the stallion, but there is in the ampulla because it's a glandular region, and so if things back up, it can back up into those glands and accumulate in there, and that's where most of the accumulation occurs. So we looked at some records of stallions we did breeding soundness evaluations on in December prior to the breeding season, and we looked at the morphology of those individuals. And of the 27 stallions we looked at, 33 or a third of those stallions had characteristics that were characteristic of the accumulator condition in those stallions. So it occurs in a fairly high frequency. high frequency. It can be extreme, it can be azospermic, or it can be producing a lot of sperm with a lot of those abnormalities, but very poor quality sperm. These were 6 stallions that we looked at here. This is the per cycle pregnancy rate of these 6 individuals going from February down through June. And there were 2 that popped out there that had lower fertility in February. Lower fertility early in the season can be due to a variety of things, not just sperm accumulation. We also know that the majority of mares that are bred early in the season are going to be maiden mares, which should be quite fertile, but you'll also be breeding barren mares, which can have a variety of fertilities. They can be quite fertile or they can be quite subfertile. So that can be a source of this as well, but sperm accumulation can also cause this. So it's well worth trying to evaluate these stallions, or at least trying to cover them on a mare to get them cleaned out prior to the breeding season, because the losses are quite significant if you have something like this. These individuals end up being quite fertile. And then we can turn our attention to reinforcement breeding, and I know this can be a little bit of a contentious issue in the thoroughbred industry, and I completely understand it. And I'm not here to take sides other than to present some information that we've accumulated over the years regarding reinforcement breeding. You're kind of familiar with the definition. This is the American Stud Book definition of reinforcement, and I think you're all familiar with it. Once a stallion finishes their cover, you can collect the dismount sample into a cup, and that can be combined with an extender, semen extender, and then reinforced into the mare. So commonly we think of it as the dismount sample, but in terms of thinking of the fertility, we can also think of it of the mares that are doubled in a single estrus as well. Now obviously that's not an ideal circumstance, particularly in stallions that are breeding large books of mares. But I'd like to show you a little bit of information that we have, particularly with stallions that may not have large books that also may be subfertile. The doubling may be important in certain select individuals. So why do reinforcement breeding? Some of the reasons can be simply an imperfect cover. So stallions may ejaculate into the vagina if they dismount early, or they are never able to intromit fully into the vagina and deposit the semen into the uterus. You can have inadequate covers due to stallions that are lame. You may have mare movement at the time. The mare moves at the time of ejaculation so that it does not end up, the semen doesn't end up in the uterus. And the whole idea is to try to increase sperm numbers in the uterus, particularly for those stallions that may be semi-subfertile. That individual that was a 50% per cycle pregnancy rate on a good day is teetering on the verge of becoming subfertile if conditions are not ideal. We tend to combine an extender with the dismount sample to try to overcome the contamination that may be in them from urine and epithelial cells, and may also reduce the bacterial load when we reinforce the mares themselves. Antimicrobials may prevent endometritis in some cases, but for me, one of the most important reasons is that it allows us to evaluate the sperm quality of those individuals. So we can save a portion of the dismount sample, put it into a preservative like a formalin type solution, and preserve that for either evaluating it immediately or later in the breeding season if a question arises about that stallion's fertility. One of the most important things we want to know is whether the sperm quality has changed. It's difficult oftentimes to look at a single point in time unless the sperm quality is very, very poor and determine whether that stallion has changed from early in the season to the time where the concern has been raised. So you can save these samples and preserve them and look at them at a future date if you're interested in doing it. We can also use these samples to look at the DNA quality using the sperm chromatin structure assay as well. These dismount samples tend to be less useful for looking at things like motility because there tends to be a very high level of contamination, either from urine, the mare's vaginal mucus, and epithelial cells can have a pretty dramatic effect on sperm motility. So this is a study that was done by a colleague of mine. He did several of them, Dr. Terry Blanchard, who unfortunately is retired right now. But he was interested in reinforcement breeding and the effect it may have on fertility. So you can see he looked at about 1,400 mares with 13 stallions, and he performed reinforcement after the first cycle of the year if the mares were open. So he didn't perform it on the first cycle, but on subsequent cycles. And what he found is he collected the samples, he looked at the concentration of those samples, the sperm concentration as well as the volume, and he looked at the effect of dose essentially. When mares were reinforced with greater than 200 million sperm, it increased the odds of those mares becoming pregnant, and that resulted in about a 12% increase in the pregnancy rate in those mares. On the other hand, when the dose was less than 200 million, while it resulted in a 7% increase, the odds of those mares becoming pregnant was no different whether they were reinforced or whether they were not reinforced. So there appears, at least in his study, to be an effect of dose on the fertility of those mares. And so dose is important. Dose is kind of an abstract term as well. We talk about a dose, but nobody will really tell you what a dose means. Is it reference to just the sperm number? Is it in reference to the quality, the motility, the morphology, the DNA quality? Is it a combination of both? And it's kind of important because dose plays a large role in the subsequent fertility. This is what's called an asymptotic graph that's used commonly in all species, and it simply shows the effect of sperm number. It's an obvious thing to show, but I think oftentimes we forget about it. There are certain individual stallions, bulls, whatever, no matter what the dose is, they never reach what you might consider to be acceptable or maximal fertility. But most of the horses we work with fit over in these other three lines that are shown here. Some, like the one on the left, reach maximal fertility with a fairly low sperm number. And we've known that since we've started looking at the effect of low-dose insemination in deep horn insemination. Certain highly fertile individuals can have an insemination dose of 10, 20 million sperm, 20 million, and they can reach that dotted line very quickly. Commonly, as we're taught in school, a dose may be something like 500 million progressively motile sperm, but that's a very generic number. There's tremendous variation depending on the inherent fertility of the stallion. But the stallions that tend to be problems are this individual right here, like the ones that responded to the reinforcement. So these horses responded when they were reinforced by going into that line or that line over there. So this doesn't mean that you should do reinforcement, and I'm not saying that, but it does show you the effect of adding more sperm numbers when there is a lot of sperm in the dismount sample. And it's a very simple concept, and we see this all the time with cooled semen, with frozen semen. We tend to ignore how much sperm we put in the individual, and we focus more on motility and things like that. So we did a second kind of it wasn't really a study. It was something, we looked at 4 different thoroughbred stallions, and this is a colleague of mine, Dixon Varner, who many of you know, and we published this previously. But there were 4 stallions here, and the 2, A and B, really had no effect, or they had an effect of the reinforcement. So when they were reinforced, they went from what is kind of average fertility and became quite fertile. On the other hand, stallions C and D started at about the same level as those 2 did, and the reinforcement had no effect at all. And so it was unclear why these individuals were this way. I don't think any of these had an overt lameness and showed any clear signs that they didn't have good covers. So it was kind of unclear as to why those 2 were so good and these 2 remained at a relatively average fertility level. So you can see it's very, very stallion dependent. The other thing to look at is the effect of doubles on mares. And Dr. Blanchard looked at this as well. And the incidence of doubles overall in this group was about 7.5%, almost 8% of the estrus cycles that mares were bred. And it ended up being about 68, only 68 out of the 902 covers that these mares had. And so for the interval to ovulation, when it was short, 1 day or 2 days, the fertility was high. But when we got out to days 3 and 4, even though those mares were doubled during that time period, the fertility really didn't change in this group of mares. And so for the doubles, overall there was a 2% increase, but it was clearly not significant in the overall pregnancy rate compared to the day 1 pregnancy rate. But individuals are important. So these were 2 individual stallions in which doubling them had a dramatic effect on their fertility. You can see that they didn't have very large mare books. They were probably older stallions, and they were experiencing a decrease in sperm quality, a decrease in testicular size, but it had a fairly dramatic effect, particularly in this one right here. If mares were only covered once while they were in estrus, obviously it was very poor. If they were covered twice and then 3 times, this horse approaches a useful pregnancy rate. And so he had the ability, because he didn't breed a lot of mares, to actually be able to be doubled and tripled 3 times when those mares were in heat. So it's an inconvenient thing to do, but it clearly shows, I think, the effect of increasing sperm numbers in those particular horses. This horse wasn't quite as bad. He was an average fertility here on one cover, but he increased about almost 15 to 20% when those mares were doubled. So the effect of doubling can have an effect in certain circumstances as well, and it makes sense. Putting more sperm in horses is usually a very good thing. So that's reinforcement, and then I'm going to jump around now and talk a little bit about the evaluation of testicular size and function. And this becomes particularly important when we're talking about first season infertility insurance, but it's also a very fundamental part of the breeding soundness evaluation. The testicles are the reason for the stallion. They produce the sperm, but they also produce the quality of the sperm as well. So being able to evaluate that is very important, and we can do it fairly easily. It's not an invasive procedure at all, and it's a very important part of the evaluation. So there are a couple ways of doing it. I like to think of, in the old days, we used calipers, but now we much prefer to use an ultrasound for a couple of reasons. The ultrasound is actually quicker to use, but it also evaluates the quality of the parenchyma of the testicle itself. These calipers, we don't use them anymore. So if you have the opportunity, and we all have ultrasounds, the ultrasound really is the preferred way of evaluating not just the size, but the integrity of the parenchyma of the stallion testicle. So there's several dimensions we do. When we evaluate it, we're interested in determining what the volume of the testicle is. We used to evaluate what's called the total scrotal width, which many of you are probably familiar with. But the total scrotal width is limited because it's only one dimension. It's a linear dimension, and obviously the testicle is a 3-dimensional structure. And we would much prefer to determine what the 3-dimensional structure is versus just one linear measurement. So we're going to evaluate several different dimensions, and to do that, we're going to evaluate the height, which you can see two pictures here that shows the ultrasound applied to the ventral surface of the testicle. And it's important to realize that the testicle does not lie horizontally. It lies in an upward trajectory like this, and so it's important to direct that beam not going straight up, but in a motion or in a direction like this, so you get the true height of that testicle. On the left-hand side there, you can see the extent of the testicle. On the top there is the body of the epididymis, and then in the back end here is going to be the tail of the epididymis. We don't want to measure those. We're just interested in the height of the testicle itself. The other measurement that we're going to do is going to be the width. Now, that was the total scrotal width that we commonly measured. Now we're going to measure the width of each individual testicle. And that's going to go from the left testicle, from the lateral to the medial. And then once we're finished with the left testicle, we're going to push it up, and we're going to measure from medial to lateral for the right testicle. This is looking at the front of the testicle here. The tail is back behind, and we're going to measure from one side to the other. This is the body of the head of the epididymis right there, the cremaster muscle going up there, and then behind that is the circulation, or the testicular artery, and the pampiniform plexus. So that's the second measurement we're going to use. And then finally, which is probably the most difficult, is going to be the length. And again, the testicle is oriented in an upward trajectory, and so it's going to be important that that beam is not oriented horizontally, but is directed dorsally towards that head of the epididymis up there like this. If you do it this way, you're going to get a much shorter length, and it's going to be inaccurate. The other thing that's going to be important is that while the tail of the epididymis may be in the visual, we obviously don't want to measure that. This thing can be a centimeter, centimeter and a half in size, and we don't want that included in the length. So those are going to be the three main measurements that we're going to use when we evaluate and measure testicular size. Then once we have those measurements, we've approximated that the testicle approximates what's called an ellipsoid, which is an elliptical three-dimensional structure. And there's a simple formula where we can plug in length, width, and height and come up with a volume measurement. And that's more than just an academic exercise, and I'll explain that in a second. So an example here, we measured a stallion's testicle. The left testicle was 132 cubic centimeters, which a cubic centimeter is the same thing as a milliliter. So if you were to put water in a graduated cylinder, it would be 132 milliliters. The right testicle was 154, and combined it was 286 cubic centimeters. And then from that just doesn't give us the size of the testicle, but we're interested in whether that testicle is efficiently producing sperm. So we want to know the function of the testicle. Size by itself is not really sufficient to determine the function of the testicle. So if we want to continue and collect semen from this horse, we can, based on that size, we can use these two formulas to give us an idea of what the number of sperm we expect this horse to produce at daily sperm output. So we're putting a size, if we're willing to collect the stallion, with the number of sperm that that horse produces on a daily basis. So we can see whether the testicles are efficiently producing sperm. There are two different formulas here just because we had kind of two different studies, and I use them just to give us a range. So we would expect this horse to produce between 5.6 and 6.1 billion sperm at daily sperm output. But it's important to recognize that there's a lot of variation in these values. So this was actually the regression graph that we created from all of the stallions. We measured their testicles and also collected them to daily sperm output. And it's important to recognize how much variation there is with any one measurement that you have. So that horse in the previous slide had about 286 cubic centimeters. Here he goes to about that 5.5 to 6 value, but there's tremendous variation in what those values may be. And remember, when we're doing this, we're not really interested in the horse that may be producing more sperm than we expect. We're interested in producing or introducing and identifying the low-hanging fruit, or those stallions that appear to be highly inefficient at producing sperm. So we're interested in the ones that are down at the bottom. We're not so much interested in the ones that are up at the top. So what can we do with this? Well, size is important. In general, bigger is better. That's true in all the species we talk about. But we want to be able to identify normal versus abnormal testicles. And I say bigger is better usually because small testicles, what we may think of as small, can actually be quite efficient. They can produce quality sperm that may have the inherent fertility that is much greater than a stallion that has a larger testicle and perhaps poorer sperm quality. So just don't assume that small is always bad. Puny is bad, but small may just be smaller than larger. Also, the large testicle can actually be quite inefficient. So just because they're large, they can actually be quite inefficient, whether it's because of an age change or whether it's because of an acute stress that horse has undergone. So the size and measurement is very important. How can we use the size? This is some work that was also done by Dr. Blanchard, and this was basically done with an eye towards first season infertility insurance. We want to know what size is good enough and what size is puny or too small, because we're going to have to make a determination as to whether we think that horse may get better or those testicles are so small that it's going to limit the ability of that first season infertility at the time you examine that individual. So one of the things he did actually histologically, a lot of work, is that he looked at the efficiency of histologic sections. And one of the things that we know that the average stallion produces about 14 million sperm per gram or per milliliter of testicular parenchyma. But what we want to know in young horses is at what point, size-wise, do they reach this level of efficiency? And he found out that, in general, most horses reach that when the testicular volume is about 80 cubic centimeters. So that means 2 testicles would be 160 cubic centimeters or total testicular volume. So that's kind of important because now we can not just take the size of any horse, but we got a general idea of how small may be too small and how small may be relative to that stallion's age. The second thing he did is just to give us a general idea of the size of 3-year-old stallions. And this kind of surprised me, and the average volume was about 239 cubic centimeters. But the important thing to recognize here is the amount of variation that occurs in these individuals. That 67 is a standard deviation. So that means if you go 2 standard deviations below 239, you're getting into the small testicular size category. So you would expect quite a bit of variation in young individuals. Some mature faster than others. Some remain relatively immature and mature later in that. So that's not particularly surprising, but this at least gives us a general idea how we can use the actual measurements that we take to give us an idea of how we should interpret size, rather than just saying things are small or large or normal or abnormal and being very generic about it. So I'll finish up with this case. This is a 5-year-old thoroughbred stallion that is a very characteristic presentation. He was recently retired from racing in November. The initial examinations revealed that he did have very small testicles, and that prevented the first season infertility insurance. The owner and agents and the prospective buyer then want to know, what do you do at this time? They're looking towards February if this stallion is going to go to stud and be a breeding individual, and what do you do? Generically, we as veterinarians tell you something like, well, you need to wait 60 to 90 days, and the reason for that is that that's about how long it takes for a new sperm to essentially be produced at the basement membrane of the testicle and the time you're going to see it ejaculated in the horse. And so that's a problem. 60 to 90 days is pretty much into the breeding season, and if that's going to be your decision, that really doesn't help the owner, the agent, the prospective owner to make a decision other than to say, well, we're just put the horse back into racing. But that's probably not the best decision that you can make. This is what that horse looked like in November. You can see the 124 cubic centimeters are clearly less than that 160 minimum, so this horse was probably not producing much sperm, if at all, at the time. We didn't collect him because the testicles were so small. But we decided to come back and re-examine him, not in 60 to 90 days, but about a month later. And this horse had changed dramatically. His testicular size had almost doubled in size. At that time, we collected semen from him, and the quality wasn't that great. The DNA quality was quite poor, but it wasn't surprising. This horse was probably starting to self-correct and start producing normal sperm. And then we came back, and about a month later, he had continued to increase in size, and the quality of his semen had improved dramatically. And so I think one of the things to learn from this, one, is not just to assume that we come back in 60 to 90 days to evaluate these horses, because they can change quite quickly. At November 11th there, we don't know where in the process we were evaluating this horse. He was off the racetrack, and I think he'd been off the track for probably a month. So he had the opportunity to let down and get away from the stress of the racetrack, and he was clearly in the process of starting to overcome that stress of racing. And within a month, he had changed dramatically. So one of the things we're primarily interested in these horses that have small testicles is whether they're changing or not. And they can change quite quickly and quite dramatically. So they may not be perfect by December 14th, but you can clearly see that they're changing. Not all of them do that. Some of them remain and continue to have very small testicles. But once they've been retired, hopefully you see something like this, but you can't always count on it. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll stop there and thank you if there are any questions, or we can wait till later.